Century Cities members call on small cells. My name is Katie Watson. I'm the Policy and Program Manager at Next Century Cities, and we're really happy to bring this information to you all because it's such an important topic. A few housekeeping details before we get started. We're asking that everyone remain on mute for the call so we can reduce the impact of outside noise. So if you have any questions, and we hope that you will, please make sure to type them in the chat box that's located at the bottom on the right-hand side of your screen. You can send them to everybody in the group or just the organizers, and we'll be sure to address them during the call. This webinar will be recorded and shared on our resources page should you want to refer back to it or to share it with others. We will also be publishing a small cells fact sheet following this call, so be sure to check the weekly download tomorrow for the link. One other reminder, please remember to have your city apply for the Digital Inclusion Leadership Awards. They can be found on our awards page on our website, and there are two categories. One is for existing programs, and one is for new programs, and there'll be 3 winners in each category. The application is due on February 10th, and I hope that you'll check it out. Chris Mitchell will be moderating the conversation today, so I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to him to introduce our panelists.
Great, thank you. I was just going to do a very quick intro to the subject before I introduce the panel for our discussion-oriented webinar. We're talking about small cells today, and just to make sure we're all on the same page, we have a graphic that illustrates some of the basics in terms of what we're talking about. Now, in this particular case on the screen, if you're able to see it, you're looking at a telephone pole that has some equipment mounted on it. Actually, the case of, I believe, both of our city panelists today, they are presumably using new poles and not using existing utility poles in most cases. So this isn't the only way that you would see this, but it's significant equipment. It's it's smaller than a macro tower that has that will cover multiple miles of radius of coverage, but it is still pretty significant. So you're looking at on the order of 100 pounds potentially, 150 pounds for one of these items. Can be up 20 feet above the ground, so it might be a little bit shorter. But that's about the size we're looking at it. David often describes it as being like 2 suitcase-sized, heavy-duty, pieces of gear. So those are small cells, typically used to improve the macro cells. So somebody, just hold on for a second. Someone's got a hot mic. If someone's in a conversation, you're, okay. I think we got it covered. Thank you. So the small cells are typically used to improve mobile cellular service by taking pressure off of the macro cells. They have a smaller radius, but we're going to cover a lot of this sort of thing. But I wanted to try and get us on the same page. So, Katie, if you want to move on to the next slide, I was going to start by introducing David Young. David Young is the fiber infrastructure and right-of-way manager at the city of Lincoln, Nebraska. If you actually are interested in hearing his voice even more, he and I did a podcast that just got posted today, and will be available and cited probably in the download tomorrow that you'll get in your email boxes. So it'd be a good follow-up. We're going to start with just a couple of comments from David. So he'll go for about 90 seconds, just some intro comments, and then we'll go through our other panelists before we start the discussion. So David, why don't you just kick us off, tell us a little bit about who you are, what Lincoln's up to.
Hello, everybody. David Young here, Lincoln, Nebraska. And what is Lincoln up to right now? About 19 degrees, I think. It's a little chilly here today.
Nice.
Seriously, though, Lincoln has a broadband master plan. We focused 2012, 2013 on businesses, 2014, 2015 on residents. And then in January of this year, we signed our first mobile broadband agreement, small cell agreement with Verizon. We're working with other carriers to attract them to our community. That is what Lincoln is up to.
Wonderful. We're going to move on to Yasha Franklin Hodge, who is the Chief Information Officer for the Department of Innovation and Technology in Boston. And Yasha, it's great to have you on our call. For people who maybe weren't there, Yasha was on a wonderful panel when we launched Next Century Cities way back in the day. So he's been with us for a long time. Can you tell us a little bit about what's happening in Boston?
Yeah, absolutely. Boston actually got started early with small cells. We had a handful of companies that began deployments almost 10 years ago now with three different licensed providers. And it was a relatively small scale deployment until recently when both the existing providers as well as a whole bunch of new folks have come on the scene with an interest in expanding networks in their installed footprint. So we've currently licensed one additional provider, which is Verizon. Our existing providers are Crown Castle, who I believe is represented on the call, Extenet and American Tower, and we're in conversations with a number of other carriers and neutral host providers to bring small cells to Boston. Right now, we have about 400 sites deployed in the city, and we're anticipating that that number could grow to as many as 1,500 to 2,000 within the next couple of years.
Wonderful. Our third panelist is Rebecca Hunter. Rebecca is the External Affairs and Strategic Communications. I'm sorry. I believe are you a VP of?
Yeah, just a manager.
Okay. Those of us that have very long titles, sometimes words get left out, and I suddenly felt like there was one missing. But you're with Crown Castle in Corporate Development and Strategy, and it's been really great talking to you as we prepared for this. So do you want to tell us a little bit about Crown Castle for those of our communities that aren't familiar with it?
Yeah, sure. So real quick, Crown Castle, we're a telecommunications infrastructure provider on the kind of neutral host side. We kind of have an above all approach. We have macro towers as well as small cell node facilities and fiber facilities. So we look to partner with cities like Boston and throughout the U.S. in many locations to try to come up with comprehensive and collaborative solutions for infrastructure needs. So that's kind of a big picture overview of what Crown does.
Great. And Rebecca, can you just give us a sense of how is a community better off after you've been able to get your infrastructure in and make it available?
Our thought, is in today's environment with the need for broadband, we really see our end objective of providing infrastructure is in line with most cities and communities' long-term objective of providing for their constituents, their businesses, and you really can't have a conversation about economic development and or public safety without talking about all of this infrastructure, whether it be a robust fiber infrastructure, and the tie-in to these small cell facilities. So it's a really comprehensive, very strategic. Long-term, as David had pointed out, and Yasha, these strategic thinking, and we think it does bring value in a number of ways to cities and counties.
And Yasha and David, I guess I'm just curious, for people who are kind of new to small cells, why, what would you say, what's your reason for being interested in spending some time today talking about small cells? Why are they so important?
Well, if you look at the research...
David, please go ahead. Yeah.
Say again?
I was just saying, David, please go ahead.
If you look at the research that's out there, more and more traffic is going over mobile. I think Cisco says by 2020, something like 50% of all traffic will be over mobile, or more than that. I don't have the statistic in front of me. But the challenge is for a city, looking at broadband as an infrastructure, mobile is the third leg of that stool. And so how can we help the carriers deploy their infrastructure to provide service to the citizens? That's really our key focus, is achieving success, getting deployment of advanced infrastructure for our citizens. And we do that by partnering with the various providers. It is important for us. We look at it just like the water system. We have a 5-year or 6-year CIP, capital improvement plan, for our system. And we have strategic partnerships that we go out actively and recruit.
And Yasha,
this is Yasha. I just add a couple other things to what David said. So in addition to providing for what we view as critically important infrastructure for businesses and individuals, there's also a revenue opportunity that exists for cities and towns with small cells. And In addition, and I think David alluded to this a bit, the telecommunications landscape is evolving pretty rapidly. I mean, the iPhone will be 10 years old in a few months, which it's kind of hard to believe that it has only been 10 years when you think about how much has changed around the invention of that device. And certainly we expect continued evolution, but one thing that we know is that regardless of how the technology changes, people are increasingly mobile and are reliant on mobile devices, and the core infrastructure of fiber optic cables is going to be important no matter where the technology landscape evolves. So if you look at some of the technologies on the horizon, things like 5G, having a high density of deployed fiber within a community is going to be one of those key enabling infrastructures that allows for community to quickly adopt whatever is coming next in the space. So we sort of look at this as both about solving a real challenge today that people have, making sure that they have the speeds they want where they want it, and positioning the city to take advantage of what's coming down the pipe in the years ahead.
Yeah, that's one of the things that I think is important, is that this is kind of the first of a presumably unending series of small cells, and that antennas will likely get smaller, they might get nearer, they're going to become more numerous. So this is not something that's just going to be going away. Rebecca, I wonder if, you know what, I want to pause for just a second to say, if you have questions, feel free to put them in the chat at any time, and we will be trying to work them in as rapidly as we can. But Rebecca, I was curious if you might be able to share with us a story of where you went to work with a community, where Crown Castle was working with a community, and you felt like the process worked very well. And I'd like to start there, and I'm sure we're going to talk some about the challenges that there are in terms of making these kinds of agreements. But I'd love to start with a positive example.
Yeah, like I said, Crown's kind of attitude toward all of this is collaboration. Trying to go in where we can and have very constructive conversations, and there are a lot of good examples of things we've been able to go in and work with communities. I think one example that we tend to use quite a bit is at Cleveland, because this is very recent. Last year for the RNC convention, we worked very collaboratively with the city of Cleveland for a very tight time frame deployment to meet that specific need. And one of the outcomes of that was we did kind of a collaborative public art project with them. So we had cabinets, obviously we needed to deploy as part of the equipment. So there was a public art contest, and the art wraps around these cabinets. And so we partnered with the city, with Public Works, I think there was a private or a nonprofit art association, and we were able to take something that potentially, again, had some aesthetic impact in the city and in some of the more, touristy areas, and turn it into a very collaborative and I think a very, very forward-thinking way that the city kind of came together and said, how can we make this process? We know we need it. We know the people coming to our towns, would like to have the service, but, we have these concerns. So we're able to partner with them on this public art project. And we've had a lot of events, again, very successful. New Orleans, we think, with the French Quarter, very sensitive aesthetically on what we could deploy. I even think, hopefully Joshua would agree, I think we've deployed some very aesthetically integrated sites up in the Boston area. So ultimately, at the end of the day, it's a very specific conversation with each specific community, understanding what their needs are, what their concerns are, and what their goals are, and then trying to find what best works, in that particular location, because it is very location dependent and neighborhood, or area dependent. So there's a lot of very positive things going on, I think, across the country. I think a lot of attention is often paid to the points we may not agree on all the time, but I do think there's a lot of positive out there.
Well, I would point to two agreements that are available publicly, one from Lincoln and one from City of Boston, both with Verizon, although they're going to be templates for agreements with other providers as well. So, David, I'm curious if maybe I'll start with you, just give us a little sense of the short version of what the public is getting as a part of that franchise, which is allowing Verizon to deploy small cells around Lincoln.
Well, and I say this in the most important way. They are getting better service. By installing small cells, you can see your speeds go from, on average here, we're getting 10 to 12 megabits a second to well over 100 megabits a second in a small cell coverage area. But specifically what we're receiving through the agreement is a few things. $2,000 annually per pole lease rate, a $1,500 permit fee to cover inspections and installation. We're getting a new pole that's designed to hold this equipment. We're getting city fiber inside the pole, city power inside the pole, and what we're calling a technology port on the pole that we can install cameras, public Wi-Fi, Bluetooth or radar connections for our traffic system on that pole. And all of that is as part of the agreement with Verizon.
And Katie, would you please put those photos up just while David's talking about it? So let me just very briefly, that's the top of the pole is the pole that he's describing that Verizon is putting in to replace existing streetlights where they're using it. And on the shot on the left, just underneath those banners, you can see a bump out. That's where a port will be, where they can install any manner of equipment. The city can install whatever it wants on that pole, and we'll have both power and connectivity, basically courtesy of Verizon to backhaul it.
Correct. We also get upgraded LED lighting on that particular pole, and the banners that you see. There's actually a banner that goes on the front that covers those two radios, the two square suitcase-looking boxes. Those will all be installed as part of this project. We're only installing the banners or the concealment elements in our downtown entertainment district and historic districts. The rest of the city, those banners will not be deployed. So.
And David, that's a question: who manufactures the pole?
Currently, Valmont is the partner we worked with to design this pole in Nebraska, but it's a pretty generic design. It's just really designed to hold the weight for two radios and the antennas that go in the top of that. I would call it a cantenna. It looks like a stovetop hat on top of the pole. Our calculations are that is a little over 200 pounds in weight. So we expect a little bit larger pole, a little bit thicker steel. It has raised the price, just to give everybody a kind of a baseline. A regular streetlight pole costs us about $2,600. A small cell design pole, small cell rated pole, this pole you see here, is $3,100. So it adds about $500 to the cost of the pole. But there are inside raceways for all of the fiber and power that Verizon needs, or any other carrier. We're carrier agnostic here. There's also raceways for the public fiber and the public power for the attachments that we will put in the pole, on the pole for our system.
And one last quick question, then I'm going to ask Yasha to jump in and describe how this is similar or not. But the question is, if there's a standalone cabinet or equipment in the base of the pole?
No, there is not. We do not allow any ground mount equipment or redundant power supplies. I think that's what you're referring to. So there are no cabinets in the base of the pole or at the base of the pole. It's actually prohibited under our contract.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I think this is Rebecca. I think that's just a different design. Chris, is some of the poles, again, depending on the municipality or what the city prefers. Sometimes you'll see a larger base of a pole where the equipment is housed versus attaching the boxes, like in this picture to the left picture. So you wouldn't see that, and they'd put the radios in the base of the pole, so the base is a little bit larger.
Great. Thank you for that, Rebecca. And Yasha, let's just has anything. Well, actually, sorry. One other thing I want to clarify was that in the agreement with Lincoln, you can find all of the specifications for this pole in an appendix that's attached to it. So people that really want to geek out, you'll be able to do that. So, Yasha, please jump in with any thoughts that this is spurred with how you're moving forward in Boston.
Yeah, absolutely. So, our agreement with Verizon is similar. We have another agreement pending with that will sort of replace our existing agreements with the other companies, as well as add a bunch of new ones. Our Verizon agreement is a little unique in that it was negotiated in the context of a larger negotiation to also come into the city and have Verizon enter as a competitive fiber provider for cable television and home and business internet service. So there's a little bit of their agreement differs slightly in some details. But if we look at the larger set of agreements that we have in the works, there's a similar structure. We actually offer two different rate models, one that's targeted at carriers, which has a flat fee of $2,500 per pole. What we found, though, is that for the neutral host providers, those are companies like Crown Castle that can offer services for multiple carriers at a single location, that they preferred a model that was based on their actual revenue received, because they don't necessarily get it can sometimes take a while to bring all the carriers or fill out a given location with carriers. So we offer companies the choice of either a $2,500 flat fee per pole or a $500 per pole flat fee plus 5% of their gross revenue from the overall system that they have in place in the city. But similarly to David, we are including in many of our agreements a fiber give back when there is construction work that's being done. And so that's something that we see as being really valuable as we try to build out and expand the institutional fiber network that the city operates to connect our schools and our libraries and our public buildings. We also, as with Lincoln, we're particularly, Boston in particular, it's a historic city, and there's a great deal of care and concern on the part of residents about the character of their neighborhoods, the aesthetics of their neighborhoods. Many of the streetlights that we have in the city have actual sort of historic value to them, and the current designs were the result of collaborative process with preservation groups and neighborhood groups to really get to designs that in some cases are specific to a single neighborhood, but which reflect the history of that neighborhood and the overall aesthetics of the area. So one of the things that we've done a lot of in our agreements is to create both the opportunity for us to work with carriers and neutral hosts to be flexible about the designs that they implement, but also to make sure that we have the opportunity to really carefully review and weigh in with feedback about everything from how to preserve decorative elements on the pole to the size of the equipment, its placement on the pole. In some cases, we've actually opted to prefer base cabinets, especially in neighborhoods where we have a lot of street furniture. The visual disruption of a base cabinet, we've gotten the feedback from our residents that that's less impactful than having something that's high mounted up on the pole. In other cases, especially where we have narrow sidewalks, mounting the equipment up reduces the impact. I see somebody asked a question about ownership, and what I'd say with that, we do maintain ownership of all of the poles, but to a large degree, the company that installs them takes on ongoing maintenance responsibility for the structure, and we have some variation in our agreements, but for the most part, we ask that the company who does the installation handle painting, graffiti removal, even streetlight replacement, though with LEDs that may not ever need to happen during the life of the equipment.
Now, there's a question about aesthetic provisions, and I'd like to get each person's response to this. There's a question, did you include aesthetic provisions? Now, I want to phrase that in such a way that my understanding is in Lincoln, for instance, that you basically, and I think this is true in Boston, that in the majority of neighborhoods where there's not specific concerns of it being a historical district or being right next to the Capitol, you basically have, the carrier can assume that they can replace streetlight A with streetlight B without having to go through a whole big process. Is that more or less how it works?
Yeah, I mean that's certainly the case for Boston, and we really wanted to. Frankly, we didn't want to be in a position to have every single location go through this extensive local process. That doesn't align with the goals that we have of trying to support the widespread deployment. But we obviously needed to make sure that our neighborhoods and our community groups had the opportunity for input as to the aesthetics. So the way we structured our agreements is that there's a approval phase for designs. There's a schedule to the agreement which has, when the agreement is signed, a number of designs attached to it, but that schedule can be amended, and there's a public process associated with the amendment through our Public Improvement Commission, and that creates an opportunity for people to weigh in, members of the public to weigh in about the aesthetics. We also, prior to bringing something to the commission for approval, we have do a lot of back and forth work with the companies around certain design guidelines that we've been developing to really make sure that what's going in there is sort of meets the general direction we want to go. But once something is on that schedule, it's exactly as you said, Chris, that there's the opportunity, the company can sort of say, I can do a like-for-like replacement. This new design is an approved replacement for this existing design. And so where there is an existing design that has an approved replacement, they can go in and swap it out. In some cases, we have poles that are of a unique design that we have not yet approved a replacement for on those schedules. And so that's a kind of work in progress, and we expect to work over time to develop suitable replacements.
Rebecca, would you like to weigh in? Or David, if you're going to jump in first, then we'll come to Rebecca next.
Oh, please, let Rebecca go. Go ahead.
Yeah, okay. Well, and like I said, so our approach and kind of some of my feedback, like we work with so many different, large cities, smaller, towns, suburban. A lot of it is very local to, the specific concerns and the objectives that municipality, may have. I think in all cases, like Yasha was, mentioning, it should be, and if anything, from this is the need for having a constructive conversation. And some of the things that I would just, one is if a city can know their assets, know what you own, be able to identify, do you own the streetlights? Does your local utility perhaps, control, the vertical infrastructure in, in your rights of way? So the more you understand as a baseline what you have, it makes it easier when you have, those conversations about what should it look like. And I see, some of the questions and things coming through. I almost look at it as, there are, places now where utilities are undergrounded or, specific historic or very sensitive areas. And so, cities kind of have to start to think, what do they want their utility infrastructure to look like? With the idea of wanting broadband, with the idea of not only now we're talking about really, commercial small cells for Verizon or AT&T or carriers who are Crown's current, primary customers, but, as David alluded to, and as, we evolve into more, kind of smart city or sensors or the needs of cities for AMR and those things to attach, the idea of co-location on poles expands to a commercial small cell, and potentially, a city attachment. So you don't want to, from our perspective, right, which may be one of the constructive conversations, but you don't want to prohibit things and at least have a way to come in and have an amendment process to say, what, we agree on this. How do we address underground neighborhoods where, those people do want to work from home or want to reach their child or various things like that. So you don't want to prohibit things, but I always kind of almost look at it like a zoning map, which cities are very familiar with. And, if you can come up with in this area, these are the 1, 2, or 3 options for what we would like to be proactive in, policy, and say this is what utility infrastructure could or should look like in these areas. And then in this area of the city, okay, it's a bus route. So maybe it's, allowing attachments to, bus shelters or, different lighting fixtures or something. So really, but take it kind of at that level and then incentivize,
what you want. And then, again, make it a process or more of a public process for things that may be more questionable or in historic areas or more sensitive. That's kind of where we like to, start. And then that way we can address those specific needs and what does the utility infrastructure look like and what are policy objectives for city uses of these particular structures that may be able to kind of overlay some of the commercial uses as well.
Thanks. I want to come back to that for a second, but let me give David a chance.
Really, I think Yasha covered it. In our agreement, we have the ability to deny or approve solely on aesthetic grounds in a sensitive location, and sensitive locations are very broad. But our goal is the deployment of this infrastructure, and we in Lincoln have about 25,000 street light poles, and the design that's included in our agreement will probably cover about 20,000 of them. And so where it doesn't cover, or we have a sensitive area or historic area, we have a pretty simple process which allows the carrier to come in and be creative and propose what we can put there. And then as we approve for those historic areas, we'll just add those to our list of approved poles and pole designs. But yes, we do have the right to decline on aesthetic grounds. With that said, our goal is to deploy this, and so we want to make sure that there is a path to be creative to deploy this infrastructure in those historic districts.
Now, in the city of Lincoln, there is not an allowance to attach to existing utility poles, right?
That's correct. We feel like our poles were not designed to have 200, 250 pounds of equipment attached to the top of them. So we have decided that if you're going to put up a small cell pole in Lincoln, you will put in a new small cell rated pole as part of that project and pole base.
And the impression that, and we talk about this in the podcast that will be noted in the download tomorrow, but it adds on the order of 10% to the total cost of the project from what David was saying. And I'd like to ask Rebecca, is it unreasonable for cities to require new specially designed poles, presumably as long as the cost isn't insane to the project? I know you said that you'd like to make some modifications here and there, but I'd also like to get a sense of some, whether it's neutral hosts or carriers might say, no, we just want to attach to existing spots.
Yeah, I think to David's point, it really comes down to structural capacity, and where we run structurals on everything anyway, just from a liability perspective, and that's whether it is attaching to an existing wood, electrical standard utility pole, a street light pole, whatever it happens to be. And I will say, to his point, we do find, the majority, probably need to be replaced because either these were put up a while ago and especially from a direct barrel wood pole perspective, a lot of them just weren't designed to handle the amount of loading that for wind loading and or just a sheer, weight loading perspective. So, we replace poles all the time. And again, everything from direct barrel wood poles to, again, custom design poles in various situations.
Okay, let's move on to some other questions here. One question is if there's a standard for a provider like Verizon where cities have underground utilities for the most part, and anyone can jump in and correct me. I don't think it is because just propagation is different in different places, so each of these is custom. So let's just leave that out there, and anyone can correct me if you would like. But there's a question about, and I know, Yasha, you have a...
Can I just, one thing I know we've talked a lot about Verizon, but, one of the things that we also, or just to put out there is a small cell, there are your, incumbent or your primary wireless carrier that, may be, again, a primary face or figure in your particular community, but every single carrier's engineering needs may be and usually are slightly different. So, what we just always say, and obviously we're a neutral host provider, but we try to take into consideration the broader need. So if just make sure when you are thinking about small cells or deploying or working, directly with one carrier, do understand that, there are other uses and depending on frequencies and a lot of other dependencies, there are variabilities from carrier to carrier. And so looking at that, or at least keeping that in mind as you're thinking about the wheres, the locations and things like that, is important.
That's a very good point. I'm glad you brought that in. Let me just stick on that for a second and say one of the things that was brought up in our internal conversations, and we weren't able to track it down to someone that wanted to be more public with it, but there was a concern that a smaller provider may not be able to get the same deal in a city, which we might be Boston or Lincoln, the same kind of deal that Verizon has struck. Can you just address that, Yasha and David?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. I mean, I think we are actually aiming for as close to uniformity as we can get in the agreement structure. We recognize that there are different carriers with different companies, I should say, with different business models, whether it's the large carriers, whether it's the neutral hosts. And frankly, we're anticipating there will be new players in the space who want to get into the vertical infrastructure as 5G technology matures. So our goal was to create a framework agreement that have parts that can swap out. I mentioned the fee model may differ depending upon the company. The designs may differ slightly depending upon the company. But the broad framework of the agreement we would offer to anyone who wanted to become a licensed provider in the city. And we think the broad agreement framework is generally applicable. So we're certainly looking for uniformity where we can get it, and something that frankly lowers the barrier to entry, because part of our sort of larger agenda with all of this is it's not just that we want an option for good cell service in the city of Boston, it's that we want a strong competitive marketplace in the city of Boston. And that means that the more companies that are in the mix who are offering various types of services at various levels, that has a lot of positive long-term benefit in building up that competitive environment.
Great. David, brief comment maybe? Or David, are you have you muted yourself?
Oh, sorry about that. I was talking away. I think the issue, price aside, if you want to do a de minimis price, you're a smaller town and you want this infrastructure deployed, 500 a year, 1,000 a year, whatever. I think the issue really is having an agreement ready to go when the carrier comes to you, and making yourself very available to that. I like Boston's model where they have two approaches. For Lincoln, we are really looking to attract, two of the primary providers and then one co-location or aggregated provider to our market. And we're actually looking at the 5% rev share in Josh's agreement for our next model. So I think it's just as important having the agreement, having it ready when the carrier comes to you as it is how much can you ask for.
Okay, Yasha, what do you do, and you have a provision here, if the equipment is abandoned or a company goes out of business or something like that?
Yeah, so it's tricky. I mean, I think we have provisions in our agreement about requiring companies to remove equipment when they are no longer using it, and there's certainly a fee obligation that persists. I mean, essentially, we tried to structure our agreement so that as long as there is the entity we signed it with or the successor, some successor entity, that they have an ongoing legal responsibility to deal with the equipment and the physical infrastructure. There is a performance bond as part of this, so that in the event of a bankruptcy or somebody completely going out of business, we have something to go after. I mean, ultimately, there is a scenario in which we could see a company going out of business without having enough of that bond necessary to cover the costs of removal. That said, I think at the end of the day, the infrastructure is still ours. A worst case scenario for us is that we replace the infrastructure with traditional streetlights. But I think we'd sort of look at that as situationally if and when it ever happens. And our assumption on this is that vertical resources in the public right-of-way in a dense urban environment with power and fiber running to them are going to be valuable to somebody for the foreseeable future. And so if we did end up inheriting a bankrupt company's abandoned infrastructure, I think there will be, certainly in today's world, there'll be plenty of opportunities to monetize it.
So there's a question about small cell infrastructure for small towns, and small towns means different things to different people. So, David, you answered in the comments already that it is practical for rural and small towns. And Rebecca, I'd love to get your perspective on this.
Yeah, and there are so when you're talking about these deployments, there's still a very big difference between, as people in more rural towns know, a big difference between the urban areas, which are getting, obviously more of the attention and more of the funding for small cells versus some of the rural areas. And I will, respectfully, disagree with David's comments. As a company that has a lot of macro tower sites, as well as small cell, and we do work with, all the major wireless carriers, it is more of a coverage, and you're not having a big block of capacity problem. Macro towers or macro sites are still a less expensive option. It's, more bang for your buck. You're on a tower at, 100 feet, you're going to get a much broader range, so you're going to cover more people. Now, what happens, and the reason you're seeing small cells in particular starting in the urban areas is capacity. It's a very capacity-driven issue. So, it's like, and if I say this too simply, but a lot of times what I'll say is, like, if you look at your phone and you have no bars, you have no coverage. If you look at your phone and you have 5 bars on your phone, but you still get a blocked call, you still get the little swirly, hourglass when you're trying to, watch a streaming video. That's a capacity problem. And so a small cell covers a very small area. It's lower height, more dense, because it offloads that, capacity. Whereas in rural areas, if there's not that, they can still get, what they need from a macro site, and it is cheaper because of just the sheer area it covers. So I think you're going to see more and more small cells, obviously, as the growth in this technology and move to 5G. And I honestly think, again, a lot of the cities, the municipalities are going to be driving with the sensor technology, with smart city and IoT and automated meter reading. You are going to be a big driver of bringing technology to your municipalities through that, because that is also a type of small cell application.
Rebecca, would you answer this quick, and then I'd like to see if David would like to respond. So if I was to just say to you that small cells are overhyped because wireless is a pain, because it's already very expensive and has massive bandwidth caps and isn't a suitable replacement for in-home wired access, would you say that I'm thinking too narrowly? Do I have that wrong? What do small cells change the game in some way?
Well, I think there's multitudes of thought. I think if you look at Google Fiber as an example, with them trying to get fiber to the home, and it's challenging in some places. It can be cost prohibitive in some places. So there's definitely a school of thought that thinks a fixed wireless, high-speed bandwidth, fixed wireless applications absolutely have merit for covering some of those last mile or into the home applications where maybe that direct fiber connectivity is still a price challenge. So I think you're going to see more and more of that discussion about, where's that line where a fixed wireless, high-speed fixed wireless maybe makes more sense than a direct, fiber to the home in every situation.
So some of these small cells could be that fixed wireless. They're not inherently always going to be a mobile service.
Right, and that's getting into like, okay, what's next, right? As they were talking about densification but you're seeing all of these amazing applications, and I think sometimes it's overwhelming. Again, even from a municipal perspective, we want to be smart, and what does that mean, and what sensor technology or how do we use this data? Great, we've got these sensors, how do we use it? So there's a lot of that changing. So small cell, I think the commercial aspect is one aspect of it, and you're thinking of the traditional kind of 4 carriers now as that commercial, wireless, cell phone space. But ultimately, you're going to see like the Googles, or you're going to see, those type of content providers, looking for that capacity. You're going to see cities and municipalities looking for that more robust data analytics part of it. So as those applications and those use cases develop, I think there's a lot of directions that small cells, in its broadest kind of definition, if you will, can go and will go.
If I could just jump in.
Yeah, Yasha, and then David.
Just jump in on that point about fixed wireless. I mean, I think we're in this interesting moment with the carriers starting to deploy dense small cell networks in urban environments that are delivering speed and capacity that is in fact capable of competing with home broadband, or at least I should say the speeds are capable of competing with home broadband. In Boston, it's not unusual to see 150 megabit over LTE with 20 megabit upstream if you're close to a small cell. I think that said, as you alluded to, Chris, their business model still is charged by the gigabyte at a rate that really does not make it competitive. Where this potentially gets really interesting is 5G technologies that are still very much in the early stages of development, but which would rely on small network or a dense network of cells on poles that could potentially replace the last mile. And that somebody on the comments asked a question about will small cells bring broadband to rural areas or small towns? If, and it's a big if, but if the technology proves itself capable that an antenna on a corner could serve all of the houses that are within a line of sight of that corner with what is effectively fixed wireless, that has the potential to lower the capital costs of bringing broadband to a community by an order of magnitude, because you're not paying that cost to run a fiber line down a street and into every single home. Instead, you're doing nodes on the corner and bringing fiber there. So it's something we're watching. I know all the carriers and everyone in the industry is watching, but even in an urban context where there are places that are hard to reach, or communities where wiring a old public housing building may prove to be cost prohibitive, if there's a way that we can use newer technology to do that through fixed wireless, that has the potential to really be a big boost for equity.
David.
Well, Rebecca and I have never met, and I'm sure we will be fast friends because friendship usually starts with respectful disagreement. I do think that's it.
Great preamble.
Right. Small cells, our research, to deploy a small cell can be as low as $25,000. To deploy a macro site, you're looking at $250,000. I think
but the area, I think, right? You need more. You need 10 small cells to cover one macro site.
So, Rebecca, that's a great point. I can assure you I'll give you a chance to respond after David finishes.
Well, and Rebecca, I agree. Is it right for every location? No. But you can get a pretty good 3/4 of a mile coverage radius on a small cell. If you're looking at a small town, there's a comment here that somebody has a town of 1,500 residents. Deploying a couple of small cells in that neighborhood or that town where an existing carrier has capacity on their network, I believe is a lot more affordable and a faster deployment than going to that same town and saying, hey, we want to build a macro tower in the center of town. I think it's a practical purpose. It is more affordable and faster to deploy this infrastructure, and that's why the industry is going to it. And I'm sure that Rebecca will agree with me that there are multiple cases where it's not appropriate.
And I would actually just add to it that I think, Rebecca, what you'd said earlier suggests that there's also going to be new entities that don't even think about macro cells that may be considering this. So I'd like to move on to something else, but Rebecca, if you have any concluding comments, go ahead.
I agree. The industry is definitely going toward small cells. I just wanted to, elaborate that there are, especially in a lot of rural cases, carriers will first attend, and that's why you still do see some macro sites trying to go in, is because it makes a business case because of the area it can cover. But ultimately, David's absolutely right. The industry is moving toward these smaller sites, and as you just said, there are many other entrants to this telecom space. The cities themselves moving into the space. are all driving the frequencies that are coming, that are being auctioned off now. They're all moving us toward, a more dense and robust small cell architecture.
That's great. So as we're running out of time, I have, I'm going to talk about something. I'm sorry if any of you are hearing my occasional dogs in the background. I am unable to mute myself, which is actually an analog for real life in my mouth. So ordinarily I would silence it if I was working from home and disrupting everything. So sorry about that. I wanted to ask something following up on what Yasha had mentioned regarding the costs of running fiber everywhere, and that's to note, the small cells are almost entirely backhauled by fiber, I think. Is that right?
So my understanding is that today that is the case, but there are a number of companies in the space that are looking at alternative backhauls, including point-to-point wireless links, or even small cells that are communicating with a macro site over LTE and then sort of replicating that signal. I think certainly the carriers that we've spoken with, everyone is looking at fiber, but my sense is that it's in flux technologically right now.
Now, in Lincoln, David, if you want to just take a short minute, you have fiber and conduit throughout the city, so you make it really easy for everyone to do small cells, which actually seems like the kind of thing that a lot of cities might want to be thinking about.
Well, I agree 100% with Josh at first. I mean, 99% of what we're seeing deployed is fiber backbone. We are in talks with some carriers who would like to experiment with some wireless point-to-point to provide service to a small cell. So, but I think the gold standard is having fiber into that pole base. Again, Nebraska is one of those states that has restrictions on municipal broadband. So we build conduit and lease it out to carriers, and carriers occupy and provide the service. So we have 7 carriers in our conduit system. Our conduit system has grown from 260 miles in roughly 2012 to the last number I saw was 487 miles, and almost all of that is private investment to extend the conduit system model. So I think there are a lot of communities out there that can benefit from that if they have restrictions on municipal broadband. And the whole argument is if we put the pipe in when we're building the road or doing maintenance to the road, the next person does not have to cut the road to put that same conduit in. And really it goes to a master planning of broadband as an infrastructure around the community, and something that we're going to need in the 21st century.
All right, let me just offer Rebecca first any concluding comments you'd like to make, because we've covered a lot of ground, but we may not have covered everything. Is there anything you'd like to make sure that the audience hears?
Well, thank you, first of all, for having us participate. But, the biggest takeaway from Crown's perspective is, again, about sitting down and having collaborative and constructive, conversation about the city's objectives, the goals, the concerns, and, understanding that for the most part, people who want to deploy small cell, we have a similar objective. And to start off with the idea that we're coming in to try to be a partner and solve some mutual, issues, I think really gets us a long way toward the end goal of providing these services, public safety and economic development and broadband services, to your constituents. So I think that's the main message we'd like to, convey.
David, let me prompt you. You can make a concluding comment, but I'd also just like you to just say, let me ask you a leading question, which is to say, should cities be afraid of small cells?
Absolutely not. There are too many agreements out there that a city could pick up, draft agreements, and run with. The technology in and of itself, I think there's a lot of discussion about making sure that it's deployed in a sensitive and aesthetic manner. But besides that argument, I think that cities should be ready for this infrastructure. Number one, it is a revenue source. We have a little over 100 of these scheduled to be deployed this year. That's $350,000 in revenue for our group this year alone. We expect that to go to about 500 citywide over the next 5 years, and those are annual payments to the city.
And I'm sorry, David, can I just, there was a conversation when you and I first met face to face, and you told me about all these great things your your franchise agreement has, the license has, and I said, my understanding is that the carriers are kind of miserly and they don't really want to give all those benefits away. You told me that if the city can turn permits around quickly, they can ask for the sky. I'm exaggerating, but that's your experience, right?
I think the skies must be reasonable, and so I don't see anybody asking for rocket packs on our side or time travel. But
there has to be speed.
Right. I think that speed is one of the most important things there. I think Rebecca would agree with me here, is that permitting speed is very important. Generally, if you submit your application for a small cell permit and it is a standard pole that we've agreed upon and it's in a non-sensitive location, our goal is to have the permit reviewed in less than 10 days and approved and out the door, and you can start construction. That is our goal. We put a lot of time and effort into our contract to make that a pre-agreed time frame, but give us the option that if we need additional review or if it's in a sensitive location, that we're not held to that standard. But the goal is, our design standard is 5 pages long. It's attached to the agreement. Everybody can have access to it. It's a public document. If you agree to that standard pole in a standard location, we want you to deploy this as quickly as possible. That's our goal. The public benefits that we've asked for in this agreement really are within the power and purview of the carrier to provide. A little bit of public fiber inside the pole, not an issue. A little bit of power in the pole. We're getting a 15 amp circuit in the pole. That's not a huge cost. We're putting in a lot more than that for the small cell equipment. Putting the concealment elements on the poles where it needs to be, where the site warrants it, putting in the LED, all of those things are pretty de minimis in the overall cost. In our conversation with the carrier, the thing they really want is to know the city is committed to this infrastructure, and when it comes to a sensitive area, that we will approach it cautiously, but there's not a knee-jerk to say no or a knee-jerk to say we can't do this, because the greater good really is to deploy this infrastructure and make sure that our citizens have access to it. We're not competing with Boston, but we like to think that we're a great place to live, and we want our citizens in Lincoln to have access to the same infrastructure that Boston has.
I'm sorry, I think Yasha lost his connection. Did you have a final concluding comment, since I just forced you to talk about all that stuff?
Really, Next Century Cities has these documents, or will have them all posted. There's a San Francisco, Houston, Boston, our agreement. Just having one to start from, and when a carrier comes talk to you, is a great thing to do. Whether that carrier is a co-location carrier like Crown Castle or a primary carrier like Verizon, I think there's a lot of benefit getting this information out there. And don't be afraid to say you don't want existing infrastructure attached to your poles if your poles are not designed to handle that infrastructure, because the cost of replacing the pole is not really the challenge here.
Great. Well, Yasha, let me give you a second here to any concluding comments. Oh, I thought he was back, but he's not. Well, we are running out of time. I wanted to make sure you knew a number of states are seeing legislation to block local authorities, to restrict local authority in these matters. And I think we'll be doing our best to educate people on this. And it's very frustrating, frankly, because we know that cities can strike these deals, and we don't want these relationships poisoned by legislation that is harmful and too restrictive. So we hope that cities can lead with best practices, and we're going to have more details available in coming months on this subject. So please let us know if you have further questions. Katie, do you have any final things we had to tell people?
No, I think you've covered everything. Again, be sure to check the download tomorrow for our fact sheet on small cells, and I'll be sure to put the agreements in there so you guys can see them. I just want to thank everybody for joining the call today as well, and glad that we had such a robust conversation. There are so many questions, and hope you all found it very helpful. Thank you also to our moderator, Chris, and to Yasha, David, and Rebecca for sharing all of your wisdom with us.
Yes, thank you all, and really appreciate your time on this.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.